Okay, Judy Cirullo, welcome to the DesuckifyWork Podacst.
I'm happy to be here again. It's always a treat to share with you, TJ.
Yeah, welcome back for sure. And this will be fun
Mhm.
because we'll dig into something a little more deeply here rather than kind of covering a lot of bases. And
Mhm.
I think what would be fun to dive into is this idea of hard, challenging conversations at work. They're just everywhere in the sense that they're needed, but we're so quick to avoid them so often. And I'd love to explore your take on that and how we can hopefully help people step into those conversations a little more.
You know, one of the first things, this is just rampant in any kind of work environment, relationship, anything that
Mm-hmm.
people sometimes manufacture stories that about how a conversation should go, might go, the end result,
Mm-hmm.
without thinking it through. And one of the first things that I really share with people when they are looking to craft and plan for a difficult conversation
Mm-hmm.
is two things that occur. Number one, think about the background context that you want to present to the other individual to help bring them into sharing the idea and the perspective. And here's what I mean. Instead of just jumping into a conversation and saying, we need to talk about your productivity,
Mm-hmm.
you might start by saying, let's, I want to discuss with you what is your expectation about the productivity standards that we've set here in our business.
Mm.
I'd like to have that discussion because as you know, we have certain criteria and metrics that we need to work on. And I'd like to hear your input or your side of how you view those particular metrics and meeting those. So
Mm-hmm.
you're setting the context for the conversation instead of jumping in with kind of the reactive attack mode, which,
Mm.
as you and I both know, puts people on resistance mode
Absolutely.
as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I want to step a little bit further back just to maybe think about what are some of the hardest conversations that show up for us at work? What are some good examples?
Well, a big one is giving and receiving feedback.
Mm.
So, yeah, um, we're really challenged with how do we give feedback so that it's received. That that
Mm-hmm.
is that is kind of more of a larger umbrella to
Yeah.
that particular question there. But the conversation is really about expectations of behavioral expectations,
Mm-hmm.
and because those are kind of require the soft skills, don't they? So
Yeah.
the behavioral expectations, um, things that revolve around demonstrating and modeling behaviors that represent the core
Mm.
values of the business,
Mm-hmm.
as well as attitudes. So
Mm.
when we bring up those topics, those are the hardest ones because they're soft skills. They don't have a lot of objectivity to them unless
Mm-hmm.
you are set you set that up properly through defined expectations and things like that. But that's the really hard part. People don't know how to handle certain behaviors and create the conversation around those.
Mm. Couple things come up for me there. One, um, the idea that you kind of got into this with the previous statement, like we can envision through the stories we create all of the challenges that will come up and all the difficulty and all these almost catastrophizing examples in our head of where this
Yes.
conversation is going to go. But for some reason, we don't tend to see the good that comes, right? I mean, if you have a really good, challenging conversation with somebody around feedback or around attitude or whatever, and it is done well, the impact that that will have on the business and particularly on that relationship within the business and the work you can do together is so great. And yet, for some reason, we have blinders onto that. One, I wonder, why do you think we have those blinders on, and how do we open things up so that we focus more on what we get from having these conversations rather than all the tough feelings we might have in them.
Yeah, and it's really, so that's where it comes to not only presenting background, but planning a conversation. And what I mean by that is when you go into a conversation with someone, starting out by just asking simple things. How are they doing? What's going on in their life? Some general questions that open the door to relationship building and trust, because without trust, you can't have those conversations.
Yeah.
And so you've got to create that relationship and that connection before you can actually talk about a potential issue that you need to.
Yeah.
And so you ask the question, how do we shift the dynamics of a conversation so that it can be, if you will, a win-win? And so first is really creating a safe space to have that discussion by asking questions that are open, that are developing that connection, that relationship. But the other thing that happens once you've done that is to really listen. You want to listen to understand where someone's coming from. So what happens when we get into those conversations, we listen with the intent to respond. So we're already thinking through, like, okay, I know what I'm going to tell them, but I'm just listening so that I can show that I'm listening, if you will.
Right.
Yeah. And so we have to dwell into that. We have to understand, acknowledge that we understand where they are. But then the biggest part of this that leads to what you're asking about, how do we come out on the other end with the win-win, is after you've kind of developed that safe space, is sharing perspective. So you are then asking the other individual to share their perspective on this particular issue, but they share it first.
Yeah.
Because you want to get their perception. You know, everybody has different lens that they look at things. And the conflict may come because they think they're abiding by those expectations when they're different than what the manager or the leader has, and they haven't actually opened a conversation to discuss that.
This is kind of fascinating to me because I think about the way most of these conversations go, and I don't think they go the way you're describing, just because of I think our conversational instincts are, I'm going to show up and I'm going to say, hey, I've noticed that your attitude's been a bit challenging for some folks here, blah, 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 blah. So what you're describing, if I'm hearing it correctly, is something like starting by asking, how do you feel about how you're relating to some of the other folks on the team? Are there any challenges showing up for you there? That kind of thing, and getting them to set the table, and then you can kind of bring in what you've observed. Absolutely.
And the more you get them to open up and discuss that, the more they start to realize that there might be an issue with what's going on, because they're talking it through. But one of the biggest things that we learn, you know, in coaching is, if you ask questions, people talk about open-ended questions, and that's pretty common. But if you ask questions that you do not know the answers to, that leads to that curiosity component. And people will start talking in a back and forth interaction, and they'll start sharing things. And you then, as a leader coach, can help summarize that for them and make sure that you are understanding what they're trying to say. And most of the time, these conversations get a little sticky because we don't take time to listen to someone else's perspective, and we make assumptions about why they are doing certain things. And you know what assumptions mean and what they lead to.
I do. And it's interesting as you talk there's, again, a couple things that showed up for me, but that idea of kind of summarizing or reflecting back to people what you believe you heard. And even kind of going, here's what I think I heard from you. Tell me if this is correct. And really giving people embodying that spirit of curiosity, right? That I am, I think I know what you're saying, but I'm not going to presume or assume that I know what you're saying, and giving people a chance to to offer correction
Absolutely.
if necessary. And I think that's really fascinating. And I agree. I think we've rushed past that.
We do.
But I think that like just the idea of, I think you said, asking questions that you don't know the answer to. And there's two pieces to that. There's don't know the answer, and then even like really not presuming that we're gonna know the answer. You know what I mean? Like
Yes.
Sometimes we may not actually know the answer, but we think I have an idea what this person's gonna say, and that clouds our judgment versus being totally open to like, I noticed this behavior, and I'm curious what was going on for you with that. Where the story in our head might be, well, they were distracted by something else, or they're just not that into their job, or blah blah blah, as opposed to tell me what's really going on there, and trying to strip away all of those assumptions.
That is exactly right. So you end up peeling the layers of the onion, not in a attack mode, if you will, but just a curiosity mode. And you don't want these to be punitive. You want people. You want to help them. You want to help them see and share what might be a barrier for them to being successful. Because a lot of times people don't know. I've had a lot of leaders that I coach with executive work. They have people who have maybe hygiene problems, and they have no idea how to handle that type of conversation.
Yeah, I could see that being tricky.
Yeah, so you just have to open up a space for people to talk and share openly and feel comfortable sharing that, and then you can navigate around that. But really, a lot of what I do is helping them navigate and craft conversations that they often will write scripts to take with them to help guide it. When what it does is it takes away the emotional attachment, and it helps bring the conversation into more of an objective. Because you know what happens when we get emotional? Yeah, it just in these conversations, right? Yeah, it certainly does. And so practicing those and laying those out are really beneficial. That's how I corrected my conversational approach to things. I wrote out my scripts ahead of time.
It's so interesting because, again, I think we assume that we should have this all figured out, and therefore the idea of needing a script or something like that almost feels like, well, why should I need a script? I'm X years old. I've been talking most of my life. Like, how do I like? And I think, again, just stripping away those stories and talking to people, human beings, we're hard, we're complicated, we are emotional. And we can always get better at this. And so, sometimes, you need to step back and go, how can I reframe the way I'm actually talking to people and relearn the way I talk to people, in that context. And there's something you said earlier that was really interesting, because you mentioned the idea of safe space. And I thought that kind of connects to the just broader, like setting the tone and the culture to me, right? And I remember when we talked last time, you mentioned the position success tool. And that was kind of a way of aligning the expectations for a particular job with the values and vision and beliefs of the company. And in my head, I'm thinking that can help set the stage. Has that been true for you, where it helps create the kind of culture where people have a sense of what's expected of them and therefore can feel more free to have better conversations around that?
That's great. That is exactly right. And that's why, anytime I talk with teams and leaders and they're sharing these barriers and conflicts, almost always it's around there aren't clear expectations. And even a step further, they're not clearly written, and they're not clearly utilized in all the various aspects. And here's kind of what I mean. We most of the time we don't have trouble with the KPIs, the key performance indicators related to productivity and all those hard, tangible items. But where we get stuck are wrapping our arms around these skills, the behavioral skills, the attitudinal skills, which I mentioned earlier, that reflect and define the core values of the business, which then align with the culture. And so this is one of the most common things I deal with, because how do I deal with these folks who push back on this or that? And because we, as business owners and leaders, we often expect people who come into the business, they automatically pick up those behaviors, and we know that they're going to act the way they're supposed to.
Yeah.
No. So that's the assumption piece. We have to be clear. Those have to be clearly defined so that people, and they need to be, these are behaviors you want people to model in the business, role model in the business, so that they align and provide a connection to purpose. But you have to visit those and discuss those regularly, or they get lost.
Yeah.
And so that helps then people wrap their arms around, oh, I know that this is the core value I have, and these are the behaviors that I'm expected to model and demonstrate. So then when you go into those difficult conversations, you have this tool where it was outlined from the beginning. And you can say to the employee, tell me how you feel like you're doing in modeling these behaviors for this core value. That creates a conversation. They aren't blindsided by it because they had the document before. And you can create a conversation and take that conversation in the same direction that I said before. Start asking questions you don't know the answer to. So people you help them see what might be missing or what might need some work, things like that.
Yeah, there's so much, I don't know what it is, but the idea of having this document is oddly comforting. It's like it grounds the conversation so well, and it allows us to refer back to an agreement that was set, that is not well, I remember your first day, you said you wanted to X. And then the other person goes, I don't remember saying that. I said I wanted to Y. And you're like, oh shoot. Versus, when we started, we aligned on these things, and here they are. How do you feel you're doing? It's just so much easier. And yet we think we can kind of hold all of this stuff just in our heads. And we think that we're speaking the same language to each other, even though we each have separate stories going on in our head. So I feel like the idea of documenting and even scripting and things like that, it creates some guardrails and some common language and some easy ways of not relying on those assumptions that we're so quick to make in business in particular. Yeah.
It is so true. And I think the other thing that happens in these meetings that it leads to is this, when you're in these conversations, one of the things that happens that leads to a faulty outcome is that people leave the meeting with the perception that the other person understands what was said and what the action plan is. 9 out of 10 conversations miss the mark. That means that when people are in a conversation and they leave the conversation, you're saying to yourself, oh, they got what I said. And they go out of the meeting saying, oh, I understand what I need to do. And they're different. And so at the end of the meeting, it is crazy. And so at the end of the meeting, it's really important to share the expectations that were stated. Okay, so now what's our action plan? What is going to happen? Tell me, reflect back to me what you agree to and the timeline, so that we know that we're on the same page. So that you reflect verbally to each other, make sure that you have shared perceptions and shared agreement. You document it, of course, but before you leave, and then you make sure that you schedule a follow-up. But if you don't reflect before you walk out of the room and share those, people go out with two different perceptions.
God, it's so relatable. And it's, the multiplier effect when you're in a 10-person meeting.
Yes.
And everybody walking out with different perceptions and different conversations that happened. I mean, I remember so many times at work, I worked in advertising for years, and you come out of a meeting where a client gave feedback on some work you presented, and And you'd all have this different conversation. You'd be like, well, I think that went pretty well, right? And somebody else would be like, I don't know. They were talking about this. And then the other person's like, yeah, but I think they meant this. And you're like, why did we even have this meeting?
Exactly.
What did we accomplish? Where if you had simply come together in the last few minutes and said, okay, great. Here's what I'm hearing. I want to make sure that we're all agreeing with that and have some time to maybe go, well, I thought I heard this, and get some clarity around that, and then go, okay, here's what we agree upon. It does happen on occasion, but I would say it's the exception to the rule, not the rule. Yeah, unfortunately.
Yes, that is exactly right. And it just takes blocking out a few minutes at the end of any meeting, like you said, a team meeting or an individual meeting, to reflect and say, now, what did we all agree on? When are we going to get it done? And go from there. But oftentimes we're in such a hurry. You're right, there's a lot of wasted time in meetings.
Yeah. And it's like just giving ourselves that 5, 6, 7 minutes at the end of a call can save so much time down the road that, like, it's, yes, we're busy, but it saves us way more time than it takes up, I think, It
really does. And so conversations, are challenging, but you got to have the safe space. You've got to have the data. You've got to make sure you take away the emotional component to it as much. There'll be emotion, but you want to mitigate that as much as you can by following a sequence that will allow that to happen.
So another thing I know you talk about is micromanaging. And I'm starting to see some threads here with this as well, because I imagine, and tell me if this is true, that micromanaging can often be a symptom of not having some of these hard conversations around feedback and expectations. And therefore, I'm picturing instances where I micromanage, just to full disclosure, like, it's like, oh, they're not doing what I thought they should be doing. I need to just go in and hover or do or take it over, versus if those expectations were set clearly. Am I close on that? Am I missing anything? And how do we move through that?
Yeah, micromanagement is one of the biggest challenges because it leads to stress and overwhelm and even burnout.
Yeah.
And so you are right on target. When we have clearly defined expectations that are communicated clearly, that are discussed and followed, it allows the employee to be more accountable and self-directed. They know exactly what they need to do, when they need to do it. You check in because you want to support people, but you don't want to breathe down their neck. Nobody wants that. Yeah. And so the leader, owner, whatever, can release the tendency to hold everything, do everything, but they can start to delegate. But when you start to trust your people because the expectations are clearly outlined and you support them in accomplishing that, you don't end up doing it all yourself and you don't micromanage. Yeah. And so it takes practice on the leader and owner side to do that. Yeah, as well as on the employees. Yeah, it's sometimes the owners or the leaders, they're the bottleneck in the business.
I can totally believe that, and again, I've experienced myself being the bottleneck, so I get it.
Me too.
On the flip side, and not even necessarily just related to micromanaging, but one of the hardest conversations I can think of in a business is the sort of managing up conversation, because there's the power dynamic at play, and yet. You want to feel comfortable asking for what you need and the support you need. And yet, God, we're not now only just afraid from a normal human interaction standpoint, but we're afraid of, like, will this come back to me in some way because they have some leadership over me? How do you help folks have that kind of conversation in a productive way?
Yeah, I talk about this a lot recently with one of my teams. Here's one of the most effective ways to do that is to ask. So if I'm the employee, you're the supervisor, is to ask permission to provide feedback. Now, so PJ, would it be okay if I gave you some feedback? Would you be okay with that? Now it's up to the leader to accept it. And
Yeah.
so I work with teams to help them put words together where
Mm-hmm.
they can manage in both directions. But a lot of it is asking permission to
Yeah.
provide feedback.
Mm-hmm.
And it works both ways. It works the
Yeah.
other way around,
Yeah.
in the reverse order. But that's one of the best tools that I've given to employees who want to say to their manager, may I give you some feedback?
Yeah. I love the permission idea. I feel like it may take some practice to take I don't know what the right word is, but feedback. The word feedback can be a little bit of a triggering word.
It
Right?
can. That's
And
right.
so
Yes.
to just like normalize that word as not like, I'm going to tell you you stink, but more like, I'm going to tell you what I need from you to support me better. And again, either direction, but certainly
Exactly.
matching up. Yeah. But
Yep.
it takes a little work, right? Because even as you said, the phrase, can I have, I'm asking you permission for feedback. I felt my blood pressure just go up a little bit because inside of me, I'm like, uh-oh, I'm bracing for it. Because that's how we've been sort of trained to
It
hear
is.
that word,
There's another tool that you can use with that, and just ask. So if you're managing up, you can also say, can I get your opinion on something?
Yeah. Yeah.
I need your input on something.
Yeah. That's a little less threatening. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And we do find that the word feedback, and people say, you're exactly right, that response is triggering. And it could be just the word feedback, which is what you just shared.
Yeah. It's really amazing how words have that effect.
Words have meaning for sure.
They do, and they have power. One question I want to ask before we start to wrap up here is, if there is, obviously there are many steps to improve how we have these difficult conversations, but if there is one great first step that a team, an organization, an individual could take to start getting better at having these challenging conversations, what would you recommend for people?
If you're talking about with a team, I think, and they're having difficulty with those, I would first ask them, what about your conversations are so challenging? Have them start looking and self-reflecting on what makes it challenging. What's getting in the way of them having it? So you first want to, it's fear. People are fearful. Oh, they're going to quit. Oh, they're going to feel like retribution, things like that. But first identify what it is that's making it difficult.
I like that.
And then the other piece to that, as you start to engage in a conversation, is be the first one to be transparent or vulnerable. And this is what I mean. I might say, PJ, I need to share with you that I'm having trouble putting words around this conversation, but I want to have a good conversation with you, but it's hard for me to come up with the right words. So can you work with me while we have this conversation?
Yeah, very disarming.
Very, yeah. So that's one of the things I work with leaders on, is they're learning their leadership pieces. They have to learn how to be vulnerable.
Yeah.
And they have to be willing to share it with their team.
Yeah. And that ultimately needs to go all the way up to the top, right? So that you have permission to be vulnerable and not feel threatened by what you're opening up there.
That is correct.
Yeah.
Yep, that is correct. So those are two things that come to mind for me
I
right away.
That. Yeah. I think the first one really puts all those assumptions on the table that we're making. We can start to see which of them are based in any kind of reality. And then the second one is so disarming, inviting. It immediately can levels any power disparities by showing that vulnerability. So that's fantastic. Judy, I want to say, first of all, thank you for going through this in such a really deep and thoughtful way. I know the business I come from, advertising, hard conversations are needed, and they're often shoved aside, or
Yeah.
mishandled at times. And I imagine that's true in all businesses and folks you've worked with. So thank you for that. The only other question I have for you is how can people find you online so that they can learn more about how to have better conversations wherever they work?
Yeah, they can connect with me on LinkedIn, which is a great place to do that.
Mm-hmm.
First name, last name, or they can connect with me via email. I make it pretty simple because I'm only on LinkedIn. I'm not on anything else. And so that they could email me, and it's first name at growstrongteams.com. So
Great.
those are the two easy ways to do that.
Perfect. I will add those to the show notes. And
Thank
again,
you.
thank you, Judy. This was an awesome conversation.
Oh, it always is with you, TJ. I enjoy it. Thank
Yeah, this
you.
was not a hard conversation.
No.
Thank you. All right.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.